Featured speaker is Justin Valliere, Assistant Professor of Cooperative Extension. He is a plant ecologist whose research is motivated by a lifelong fascination in plants and a passion for conservation. The spread of invasive species, along with other global change drivers such as nitrogen deposition and shifting climate conditions, threatens native ecosystems and complicates restoration efforts. And a critical challenge in ecological restoration is bridging the gap between research and management to develop effective science-based strategies. Justin's research focuses on understanding how human-caused disturbances shape plant communities, identifying the mechanisms driving ecosystem change, and informing land management decisions to improve restoration outcomes. So today, Justin will cover interactions between climate change and invasives, weed invasion in the Santa Monica Mountains, invasive plant control and restoration, and using vegetation monitoring data. So I'll pass it over to you, Justin.
Great to be here. So as Shobha mentioned, I study interactions between environmental change and invasion of non-native plant species, and that includes management of invasive plant species. So today I'm going to talk mostly about my work in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which some people might not realize it's actually the world's largest urban national park. So this is located directly northwest of Los Angeles. So a huge amount of open space, but directly adjacent to really urbanized and suburban areas. So right in the WUI, the wildland urban interface. So it's a really beautiful national park, but it also faces a lot of unique challenges because of that influence of urbanization as well as invasive plant species. So just a brief outline of today's talk. I'm going to talk about invasion and global change in California. I'm mostly going to focus on Southern California, but this applies to other areas throughout the state as well. I'm going to talk specifically about impacts of these drivers on the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, just to provide a bit of context to why this is such a challenging place to fight weeds. And I'm going to share some of my own research looking at those impacts in the park. So I've been working in the park since like 2011 for my dissertation work and then some of my postdoc work, and I still continue to collaborate closely with the Park Service there. And then finally, I'm going to close with a presentation about how we're using weed treatment and monitoring data to inform adaptive management of weeds and integrated management of weeds within the park. So I'm mostly a restoration ecologist. So the question that kind of motivates most of my research is how can we conserve and restore California's plant communities in the face of environmental change? And so there's multiple drivers of change that both necessitate restoration, but they also complicate restoration. And this includes nitrogen deposition due to air pollution, extreme drought and changing climate conditions, of course, non-native plant invasion, as well as altered fire regimes. And these different factors interact and can even exacerbate the impacts of other drivers as well. And that's kind of the focus of a lot of my research. Most of the work I'm going to mention today is in coastal sage scrub, which, if you're not familiar, it's called coastal sage scrub because it grows mostly along the coast from Baja to Northern California. It has a number of sage species as well as Artemisia sagebrush, which isn't a true sage, but it smells like a sage. And it's scrubby, so you can see here it's a shrub-dominated ecosystem. But I will say that some of the impacts that I'm going to discuss today, they apply to other ecosystems as well, like grasslands or woodland savannas. So it's not restricted to coastal sage scrub. This is just where most of my previous work took place, the ecosystem. I'm just going to provide a little bit of a background on each of these drivers of environmental change. So you all might be, oh, sorry, I got a poor network quality notification. Hopefully you all can still hear me. Just let me know, Shobha, if I start to break up.
Will do.
So nitrogen gas is super abundant in the atmosphere. It's about 78% of the atmosphere, but this is in the form of N2 gas. So if you remember back to your chemistry classes, that triple covalent bond that bonds those two nitrogen atoms, it's the strongest chemical bond in nature. And so that nitrogen isn't actually bioavailable. It's not available for microbes or plants to make use of. So in most ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, nitrogen is actually pretty limiting, and plants have evolved in that context of nitrogen limitation. And the only natural ways that that nitrogen becomes available is through nitrogen fixing bacteria and then lightning strikes. But this is a relatively like small proportion of nitrogen in the world's like nitrogen budget. But humans have gotten really good at breaking that chemical bond. So first through the Haber process for developing fertilizers for agriculture, but then kind of unintentionally through the burning of fossil fuels. So from our tailpipes and from industrial emissions, a lot of different forms of nitrogen go up into the atmosphere, and what goes up must come down, and so it settles back down to the Earth's surface, and that's what we mean when we say nitrogen deposition. And it essentially fertilizes ecosystems, which might sound like a good thing, right? Like plants need nitrogen. But as I'm going to show you today, it can have some really negative consequences for ecosystems. And this is a problem worldwide. So this is showing a global map of rates of nitrogen deposition. This map is a little bit outdated. It's probably even worse now. So the red is elevated levels, the red and orange, and you can see California is a hotspot of elevated nitrogen deposition. This is zooming in a little bit, and you can see the red is basically the Los Angeles basin, where lots of air pollution is emitted and also gets trapped. So we get pretty high levels of nitrogen deposition throughout the area. This is also true of the Bay Area in Northern California, so it's not a problem restricted to Southern California. And of course, in addition to all that nitrogen in air pollution, we also have greenhouse gases, and we know there's a clear connection between those rising levels of CO2 and methane and climate change. This can lead to, of course, rising temperatures, but also more variability in precipitation, leading to what we call global change type droughts. So this is when precipitation is below historic averages and temperatures are above historic means. And then finally, we have non-native plant invasion, right? So this is an ongoing process. So since the Spanish colonized California, we've had many plant introductions throughout the state. This figure is just showing the total number of non-native plant species over time. Not all of these are invasive, but some of them, many of them are. So I compiled this data using historic herbarium records for some of our iconic national parks within the state. And I just want to highlight that if you look at the Santa Monica Mountains graph, we have kind of the steepest increase in the number of plant species, and it appears largely linear. And so the Santa Monica Mountains, because it's so close to LA, and where some of the first missions in California were, it's kind of like the epicenter of a lot of non-native plant introductions. Every spring, you know, people get really excited about super blooms. I've already been getting questions about whether or not we're going to see a super bloom in parts of the state this year. But as most people here know, this is pretty unpredictable. It doesn't happen every year. But in lots of parts of the state, we get a pretty predictable super bloom like the one shown here. But of course, this isn't a native plant species. This is black mustard, a really dominant invasive plant species, not just in Southern California, but along the coast. The image in the background is from along the 101 freeway in the Santa Monica Mountains. So this is one of the many problematic invasives that the park faces. And this species has been here for a really long time. So the legend is that the Franciscan Padres actually spread it along the Camino Real to find their way in between the missions. I don't think that's probably true, but it was probably accidentally introduced. But regardless of whether or not that's true, it's now very dominant along that route, which is essentially now the 101 freeway. And this species probably took root and became invasive quite early. This is a historic image that I found online from the turn of the century. And it might be hard to see, but you're going to have to trust me. But these plant skeletons, these dried plant skeletons next to this bell post, I'm almost positive that that's black mustard plants. So became really dominant early on. And it's just one of the many plant species that was probably originally introduced during the mission period. So in the foreground here of one of the earliest missions in the San Fernando Valley, a lot of that standing biomass is probably invasive annuals, invasive annual grasses and forbs. One of the reasons we know like when some of these early problematic species were introduced is from some really creative research looking at the seed content of adobe bricks. So folks as far back as the 1920s soaked and dissected these bricks and looked at what seeds and plant material were in them. And black mustard was one of those species, as well as a number of other weeds that folks might recognize here. So in addition to the, or following the mission period, the next kind of important historical event for the spread of invasive plant species throughout California, but also including the Santa Monica Mountains, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but is located right here, northwest of Los Angeles, was the Rancho period. And this is when huge tracts of land were used for cattle grazing, and that disturbance of grazing likely wiped out a lot of native plant communities and allowed for the spread of a lot of these non-native plant species. In addition to accidental introductions or unintentional introductions of invasives, there were also some intentional introductions as well. So this is a historic image from 1895 in downtown Los Angeles. And if you know what you're looking for, you can notice a number of ornamental horticultural species that are now problematic invasives in the Santa Monica Mountains, as well as throughout the state, like Mexican fan palm, English ivy, pampas grass, and pepper trees. So these are some examples of garden escapes that are now invasive in wildlands. And then some species were intentionally introduced for other reasons. So this is a really frustrating image that I found of the California Civilian Corps actually spreading mustard seeds. So you can see they're holding these burlap bags or satchels of seed. And so folks used this to prevent erosion following fire, which I'm sure it worked initially. Like mustard germinates really early, grows really fast, could stabilize soil. But this could be one reason that huge amounts of shrublands, chaparral and coastal sage scrub, were displaced by mustard in these areas. And there's also evidence that this could have altered fire regimes even really early on. So this is an image from 1943 in Topanga Canyon. Folks might know of the recent Palisades fire in Southern California. Topanga Canyon was part of the area that was burned. And we can see, again, these plant skeletons here. I'm almost certain that those are black mustard skeletons. And then finally, the next major historical event that impacted the invasion of the Santa Monica Mountains was likely the freeway period. So this is showing the construction of the 405 freeway. And if anyone's ever driven down through the Sepulveda Pass on the 405, you'll notice along both sides of the freeway a fair amount of invasive plant species, and some areas completely dominated by this species, fountain grass. And so those are some of the historic introductions and spreads, but new invasives are emerging all the time. So these are new introductions, newly arriving species. But there's also probably species that were introduced a long time ago, and they're only now getting a foothold and exhibiting invasive behavior. So one example of this within the park is Euphorbia terracina, or carnation spurge, I believe is the common name. So even in the time that, the 15 years that I've been working in the park, I've really seen this species explode and spread into other areas. This figure here is kind of showing your typical invasion curves. So what I'm showing here is time on the x-axis and then range size on the y-axis. So once a species is introduced, we usually see a lag phase between establishment and really exponential spread. And then a species will reach a new carrying capacity. And what I'm really interested in is how environmental change might lead to increased levels of invasion in some species or allow more species to escape that lag phase more quickly. Invasive species can have really catastrophic effects, not just on native ecosystems, but also on humans. So we know that there's a clear link between invasive plant species and increasing fire severity in California and frequency and size. And this is largely driven by invasive annual grasses. So in spring, when we get good rainfall, we see green hillsides dominated by these species. But of course, when they dry out, these become really flammable fuels, what we call flashy fuels that can catch fire really easily, and they can also carry fire really well across the landscape, leading to more frequent ignition events and then larger and more frequent fires. And so this is a graph just showing the number of wildfires over time in California. We can see a clear positive trend. These data only go until 2013, and I know that if this was an updated graph, we would see even more fires on in the recent decade. And so a lot of my research in the past has focused on how these different drivers of global change will impact native ecosystems within the park in the Santa Monica Mountains. And as I mentioned, this is the largest urban national park in the world, and that all those factors can really make this problem of invasives even more challenging than it would be already. And so some of my work has been looking at nitrogen deposition specifically. How does it influence native plant species as well as invasive plant species? So this is just a shot showing some coastal sage scrub, rather degraded coastal sage scrub with views of downtown in the distance. So these areas directly adjacent to urban areas can get really high levels of nitrogen deposition. So for one study, what I did is I visited 30 sites throughout the park. The red sites over here on the right to the east are sites like Runyon Canyon or Griffith Park. So Runyon Canyon, you might know, is where the Hollywood sign is. So those areas get really high levels of nitrogen deposition. And then as you move westward towards Malibu and then Thousand Oaks, you get lower levels of air pollution and therefore lower levels of nitrogen deposition. And so this leads to, not surprisingly, really significant increases in available nitrogen in the soil. So this is showing nitrogen deposition on the x-axis and then extractable nitrogen on the y-axis. So clear positive trend. And this has a really negative consequence on native forb richness. So forbs being wildflower plant species, so native wildflowers. So you can see as nitrogen availability in the soil goes up, we get these really steep declines in native plant diversity. But if we look at the impact on non-native plant species, so weedy plant species, we see that they benefit from that added nitrogen. So they're really good at capitalizing on that increased resource availability. You can see non-native cover is going up linearly as nitrogen deposition increases. And these two results are probably related, or they are related. So if we look at weed cover on the x-axis here, and then total plant richness, native plant richness per site, or the mean richness per plot, we see a really steep negative relationship. So more nitrogen deposition, more weeds, less native wildflower species. So that was an observational study across the park, but you can imagine there's a lot of other confounding variables that could differ across those 30 sites. So I validated some of this using nitrogen fertilization plots in the low polluted areas of the park. So this way I knew exactly how much nitrogen was going into the area, into each plot, and I could quantify the impacts in a more controlled setting. And so this study coincided with what at the time was one of the worst droughts in California's history, so from like 2013 to 2016. And so I monitored different parameters of vegetation performance within those plots. And so what I'm showing here is just native shrub cover in the control plots, so no nitrogen added. And you can see that drought had a really negative consequence for native shrub cover, so a really steep decline from 2013 to 2014. And you can see how just sad these shrubs look like. This wasn't taken during the summer. This was actually taken during the growing season. So pretty sad native shrublands here. But if we look at the impact of added nitrogen, so the red is the highest level of nitrogen, you can see that shrub loss was even more severe when you get that added nitrogen deposition. And if we look at the percent of shrubs that died off during this period, you can see the high nitrogen plots had the greatest levels of shrub mortality. I also looked at herbaceous vegetation. So even though there were some really dry years here, there was still enough precipitation most years to stimulate germination and growth. So if you look here, this is again showing the control plots, so no added nitrogen. If we look at non-native cover and then non-native biomass, so weed cover, weed biomass, as shrubs declined, we get pretty modest increases in these non-native plant species. So that shrub die-off kind of created a window of opportunity for those weeds to take root. But if we look at those nitrogen addition plots, we can see that that invasion during the drought was even more severe when you added that nitrogen. Another unanticipated thing that happened during this study was we had the Springs Fire in 2013. So huge parts of the western part of the park burned. And so this was concerning to me because it burned some of my dissertation plots, but it was also a cool opportunity to see, well, what is the impact of this added nitrogen on invasion post-fire? So we set up a really similar array of nitrogen fertilization plots in areas that had burned. And we wanted to understand how does this influence invasion and also how invasion history impacted recovery. So I installed plots in areas that were previously invaded by non-native grasses and then areas that were relatively pristine and uninvaded areas. And so I tracked this for 3 years, again, in the invaded plots and the uninvaded plots. These blue dots, again, are showing just the control plots. And I looked at native forb cover, so those native wildflowers, native richness, and then non-native cover. And what you can see here is that in some years, especially the second year following fire, that added nitrogen really reduced native wildflower cover. It also reduced native richness, especially in those previously invaded plots. So richness is just the number of unique plant species. And then it really increased non-native plant cover. This might seem like relatively modest increases, but it had really negative consequences for native plant species, especially those really unique fire-following plant species. This is an ordination plot. So each circle and each triangle here represents one of my study plots. And what this analysis does is it basically illustrates how similar different plots were in terms of their community composition. And so what I'm showing here is the uninvaded plots. The previously uninvaded plots are the triangles. The previously invaded are the circles. And you can see those cluster in different areas. And then I have the nitrogen treatment. So blue is the control, high is the highest nitrogen addition treatment. So we can see the previously uninvaded plots have unique vegetation composition compared to those previously invaded. But what you can also know is that the control plots are clustered here along the bottom right portion of the graph. The higher nitrogen addition plots are more upwards and to the left, meaning that that added nitrogen shifted the community composition in those previously uninvaded plots, but even more severely in those previously invaded plots. So loss of native wildflowers, increases in non-native plant species, and a really dramatic shift in community composition. And then I also did what's called an indicator species analysis. So this tells us what species are significantly associated with those different treatments. And so these are all a diversity of native wildflower species that were all strongly associated with the control plots, which means that they were negatively impacted by the nitrogen addition plots. I forget the common name, Whispering Bells, I think is its name, Eminanthe pedundiflora. This is a unique fire-following species. This was only really present in the control plots and the lowest nitrogen addition plots. And then the species that were associated with the high nitrogen plots were red brome and short pod mustard, Hirschfeldia incana. So two really problematic invasive plant species. So these unique fire following species are negatively impacted, invasives increase. So just to kind of recap some of these results, nitrogen deposition appears to really drive the loss of native wildflower species and it promotes invasion. It also exacerbates drought-induced shrub mortality, and that creates a window of opportunity for invasion. It also really elevates wildfire risk. And then it also seems to really alter post-fire patterns of native plant recovery and also increases post-fire invasion. And again, that could create this positive feedback loop with fire. I want to talk just briefly about some of the mechanisms, like why do invasives seem to really benefit while nitrogen deposition really hammers the native shrubs and forbs. And if you recall that increased mortality of shrub mortality in the high nitrogen plots, this was driven actually by physiological changes in the shrubs, I think. So what this graph is showing over time, water use efficiency in these native shrubs. So basically how conservative these shrubs are being with their water use. And what you can see is that the control plots, the native shrubs had higher water use efficiency, so they were a bit more careful with how they used water. Whereas nitrogen addition seemed to really stimulate leaf growth and made the plants use water more rapidly. And that probably increased susceptibility to drought and is partially responsible for that increased dieback that we saw. And so just in summary, this added nitrogen, it might initially improve productivity. It also increases leaf area relative to the size of the branches, and it increases leaf nitrogen, which leads to increased gas exchange and water loss. And that decreases water use efficiency and decreases drought tolerance and survival. So this was a really interesting result to me, and I did a follow-up study. That one graph was showing just with California sagebrush, and I wanted to see if this operated in a bunch of different native perennial plant species. So deerweed, sagebrush again, California bush sunflower, I forget the common name for some of these, black sage and Stipa pulchra, native bunch grass. And I wanted to compare this to some of the really problematic invasives that I saw that really benefited from added nitrogen. And so plants, they need to balance growth with resource use efficiency. So what I'm showing here is water use efficiency on the x-axis, so high water use efficiency on the right, really conservative, low water use efficiency on the left, and then relative growth rate on the y-axis, so how fast a plant grows. And what we typically expect and what's shown here is a trade-off. So if you grow really, really fast, you're not being very conservative with your water use. And so you can see here for almost all of these native shrub species, we get a negative trade-off where the plants that grew the fastest had the lowest water use efficiency. But when I looked at this in the invasive plant species, they didn't play by the same rules. So you can see here, none of these invasives experienced that trade-off. This invasive oatgrass actually showed the opposite pattern where the species or the individuals that grew fastest were also the most water use efficient. And in general, all of these invasives had greater water use efficiency and greater growth rates compared to the natives. So that was showing within each species. I also looked at this across each species. So in these graphs, each circle represents one of those invasive plant species in the yellow and one of the native plant species in the green. And I looked at this under low nitrogen and high water, low nitrogen and drought, high nitrogen and well-watered, high nitrogen and drought. And what I just want to point out here is that especially when resource availability is high, these invasives cluster in a different part of the graph where, again, they're showing really high rates of growth and really high water use efficiency. So they're basically like cheaters. They don't play by the same physiological rules as the natives, and that's probably one reason that they perform so well. So these pie graphs are showing the relative proportion of invasive to native biomass. I did this experiment in these dish bins, so these little community mesocosms. And you can see that the invasives were always winners, so they accrued more biomass, but especially when nitrogen availability and water availability was high. And so, yeah, again, these invasives, they perform better, especially under nitrogen addition, because they benefit disproportionately in terms of their physiology. And also in terms of the timing of their life history events or their phenology. So invasives, as many people here might know, they're some of the first species to germinate when we get rains. So what this graph is showing is days to emergence or germination after watering these plant species, and then the total biomass that these plants accrued. The orange and the yellow are invasives, the blues are the native plant species. And what you can see here is that the invasives tend to germinate earlier, and they benefit more from that added nitrogen. They grow much more rapidly and accrue more biomass. And so the natives kind of suffer even more from that delayed emergence, which is another reason that the invasives win. And then this is just showing the same thing across all plant species. So native annuals essentially pay a higher cost for delayed emergence, which is one reason why that added nitrogen addition might lead to lower diversity of native plant species. Invasive annuals also just grow larger in general, and they produce more seeds even when water availability is pretty limiting. So this is showing total plant biomass and the total number of seeds produced by the invasives in yellow and the natives in green. You can see that the natives, even under drought, they just outperform the invasives just outperform the natives. So just to briefly recap some of these mechanisms, nitrogen deposition, it reduces native plant water use efficiency. And these invasives seem to have these forbidden trait combinations that we don't see in natives. And it's one reason that they're the winners under climate change and nitrogen deposition, because that strengthens some of the phenological and physiological advantages that they have. Okay, so that was, I hope, some context and hopefully not too data heavy and boring. But I think it highlights why fighting weeds in this park might be particularly challenging. And so now I'm going to talk about not my own research projects and experiments, but utilizing some long-term weed treatment and monitoring data from the park to inform adaptive management within the park. And so I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this part of the talk. Olivia Parra is a PhD student in my lab, but she was formerly a technician for the National Park Service. And so she's the one that went out and resurveyed a lot of these weed treatment areas within the park. And then Joey Algiers is my collaborator in the Park Service. He's the park's restoration ecologist. And so what we wanted to know was, what are the long-term outcomes of weed management? And then to see if we can use long-term monitoring data to identify what are the predictors of success and failure. This might seem like a pretty simple and basic question, but folks that work in natural areas on weed management are probably familiar with this situation, that resources are so limited. There's not a lot of time and person power to allocate towards monitoring. And so a lot of parks and natural areas, they might collect data on what treatment methods were used and do some monitoring, but oftentimes analyzing that data, just there's not the resources or the time or the statistical expertise to do that. So in a lot of places, these data sets could be a treasure trove of information that are often just like sitting on computers somewhere. And I'm not saying that as a dig to the park. Like, they do excellent weed work. Lots of places do. But I think we can learn a lot from these data sets that are just kind of sitting on these hard drives. And so that's what we wanted to do here. So what we did is we compiled historical treatment data within the park for nearly 280 weed infestations spanning nearly 2 decades. So every time the park goes out and treats a site, they record cover and size of the infestation, what treatment methods were used, so whether they were chemical or non-chemical methods. And then what we did is we resurveyed all of these sites in spring 2023 to see what was the long-term outcomes of those treatments that were invested in control. And so we didn't just monitor what happened to those target invasives, we also collected data on the native plant communities in the area. And then to analyze these data, we used traditional statistical approaches like regression or ANOVA, but we also used machine learning, so random forest models, and I'll explain more about those in a little bit, to understand like what are the key predictors of when control efforts are successful, but also when they might not work. And this work was funded by a grant from the Western Association of National Parks. So first, we wanted to know just in general, how effective have control efforts been for some of the primary species targeted? So folks might be familiar with some of these. We have Italian thistle, yellow star thistle, carnation spurge, I believe flat white top is the common name for Lepidium, and then harding grass, Phalaris aquatica. So there were many other weeds that were treated that we had data for, but these were the ones that we had the best coverage for, the most number of sites. And so what I'm showing here is density plots. So they're basically smoothed histograms. So it's showing how many sites had a given level of percent cover. So for example, here, like in the red, most sites had a cover of this value here. It's basically just showing the distribution across all 280 sites. So the red is showing at the time of first treatment. So the first time a site is treated, they collect data on the percent cover of that target weed species. The blue is showing from our resurveys in 2023. And what you can notice here for all 5 of these plant species, we get a shift towards the left, towards lower levels of percent cover. So what this shows is that in general, management does work. It reduces percent cover across these treatment areas. And then we also looked at this in terms of infestation size, and it's not as dramatic here, but you again can see a shift leftwards. So it didn't eliminate these populations of weeds for the most part, but it did help control them in terms of the size of the infestation and the density, the percent cover. But this is showing how many of those populations, the proportion that were actually successfully eradicated. So you can see that a really small proportion, especially for some of these species, about like Lepidium, a very small proportion were actually fully eradicated, meaning that they weren't present at all in 2023 when we went back and looked at these sites. That might seem really discouraging and depressing, but it's important to note that these are really widespread invasives. They're not these EDRR, or early detection rapid response species. So they're really widespread in the park. They probably have really persistent seed banks, and there's probably other sources of seeds coming in from adjacent untreated areas. So this isn't that surprising that we don't see higher levels of eradication. But it does beg the question, why is weed control successful at some sites but not others? And that's what we wanted to answer. So first, I looked at what site level factors might influence management outcomes. This is a really sad photo showing that euphorbia species that's dominating this hillside. This, I think, is actually not within the park. This is adjacent area that's not publicly owned. So the park's not able to treat it here. And it just highlights just how well this species can take root when no control is undertaken. So first, I looked at the probability of eradication based on the infestation size and the initial percent cover. And not surprisingly, larger infestations are more difficult to eradicate. So as you go up in infestation size, the probability that you're going to eradicate it becomes smaller and smaller. Same thing for the initial density or the initial percent cover of that infestation. We also found that infestations on steep slopes are much more difficult to eradicate. So as the maximum slope goes up, you have really, really low levels of eradication success. That's probably because these really steep sites are much so they might not get treated as frequently. And it's just harder to navigate and see things on these really steep slopes. So the treatment might not be as effective as on more level ground. And then I also found that fire frequency influenced these results. So sites that burned more frequently had much lower levels, much lower probabilities of eradication success. And so I think these results are rather intuitive. Like I think most land managers would expect these results. But I think it's really useful to see this play out in this data set, in the real world management data. Next, we wanted to look at how different management inputs influence these control efforts. And so we looked at relationships between times treated and percent cover reduced. And so you can see this is pretty promising. So the more frequently you treat an infestation, the greater success you're going to have in terms of reductions in plant cover, as well as reductions in infestation size. So this shows that management does work if you are persistent. And then we looked at the hours per hectare invested in each site and percent cover reduced. And again, this is a reassuring sign. It shows that the more hours that you invest per area, in general, you're going to see greater reductions in cover. And then finally, I looked at just raw labor hours invested in each site in terms of the reductions in infestation size. And this looks really optimistic if you just ignore the second part of the graph, right? So you invest more time, greater control success. But then we get these sites where a lot of effort and time is invested, but we don't see successful control. So greater investment in control works, except for when it doesn't. And I think these are what I would call treatment traps. So areas that just get treated again and again, but the species is not eradicated. And so it just becomes this kind of time sink and resource sink for the park. And we wanted to understand, well, like, why is that? Why do some sites, why are they so resistant to successful control? So now I'm going to show just a case study looking at one species. I did a similar analysis for several plant species. The yellow star thistle was, it's one of the most problematic species throughout the state, so it's a good candidate for this case study. And it's also the plant species that we had the greatest number of infestations for, so the greatest statistical power. And so this is a species that's a high priority for management, and the park has seen some great success. So this is showing an image from 2009 at Paramount Ranch, where all of that gray green, if you know this plant species, that's really dense areas infested with yellow star thistle. But this is a image from 6 years later in 2015. And so the yellow that you're seeing in the background here, it's not yellow star thistle, it's a native tarweed. So really low levels of star thistle here, virtually eradicated in much of this part of the park. And then a more recent image from 2019. So the orange here is our native poppy. The green is mostly other annual grasses. So I'm not saying that there's no weeds present here, but pretty successful control at this site for yellow star thistle control. But if you remember back to that pie graph, about 75% of these star thistle populations were not eradicated. So I used what's called random forest models to analyze this statistically. And this approach is really useful when you have really large, messy data sets. And if anyone here has ever collected weed treatment or weed monitoring data, you know that sometimes these data need to be collected in a rapid, quick and dirty kind of way. So you end up with these data sets that have a fair amount of noise in them. And then also we had a ton of different variables that could influence this. As I showed earlier, site level factors can really dictate success or failure. And then management inputs can influence this. So when you have a whole lot of variables that might be correlated, this method is really, really useful. So I looked at a few different metrics of treatment success. So first I looked at the change in infestation size, and I basically threw every variable I had at this. And this random forest model, it tells us what are the variables that are most important in explaining this outcome. So if we see here for the change in infestation size, the best predictors were how much time was invested in control, the initial cover, slope aspect was also really important. And then some other factors too, like the number of foliar spot treatments, or whether or not the site was situated in a fuel modification zone. So fuel mod zones, if you're not familiar, they're mowed every spring to reduce annual fuel loads and reduce wildfire risk. I also looked at the metric of percent cover reduced, and we can see some familiar variables that are important. So the initial infestation size, the amount of time invested, and then the number of foliar spot treatments. And then eradication success. And what's interesting here is that the key predictors here actually seem to be site level factors. So the slope aspect and then the elevation of the site, as well as some other variables. The orange ones were just not significant from the statistical test. I just want to know it doesn't mean that they're not important. What this model does is it just pulls out like the best predictors. So those model outputs are really useful for understanding what may or may not be important in predicting success. But again, it doesn't mean that none of those other variables aren't important. But I pulled out some of these key relationships, and I think what these models can be really useful for is identifying some of those key predictors. So what I'm showing here is the relationship between labor hours and then the size change. So the more time invested, the greater control you get of this plant species, which is great and promising if you're a land manager. I also found, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the more foliar spot treatments, so these cleanup treatments with backpack sprayers, the greater change in cover you get. So this doesn't mean that broadcast treatments, like using a boom sprayer, so really wide applications of herbicide, it doesn't mean that those aren't really important. They are for treating really large areas. But I think what this shows is that persistence is key, and you can't just rely on those like one and done broadcast treatments. It's really important to do these follow-up spot treatments. And then what this figure is showing is the maximum slope of sites that were eradicated in the yellow and then sites that were not eradicated in the orange. So you can see that steeper slopes are again like more difficult to eradicate this plant species. So that's showing control success, but we also wanted to understand like what happens to the native plant species, because ultimately that's our goal, right? Like we're not just trying to spend endless time killing weeds, like we want the native ecosystems to recover. But this is actually pretty rarely evaluated in the literature and like within parks, often again because there's just finite resources, right? And so when your main priority is reducing weeds or reducing fire risk, there's often not time to go out and monitor what happens to natives. So that's what we did in this study as well. So I used those similar models to look at different metrics of what happened to those natives in all of these infestations. So we looked at the percent native cover, the number of native plant species at each site, and then the number of native plant species per area. So you can, I'm not going to read through all of these lists, but you can see that there's a whole lot of key factors that influence what happens to natives. And this is due to the infestation itself. So like the initial non-native cover or the number of non-native plant species, as well as site level factors like fire frequency, as well as management inputs like the number of foliar spot treatments or the number of hours invested, the number of years a site was treated, or the time since the time that has elapsed since the last treatment. So lots of different factors are important. But let's look at some of these key factors here. So if we look at non-native cover versus native cover, not surprisingly, we see a negative relationship. And so what I'm showing here in the blue is just all non-native plant species. So we get these really steep declines the greater the cover of non-native weedy plant species. But if you see here in the red, invasive plant species, they just reduce native cover more. So you just get lower levels of native cover for a given cover of non-native, or sorry, of invasive cover, just compared to non-natives overall. So invasives really drive and really suppress native plant species, unsurprisingly. This is probably my favorite figure from the analysis because I think it really highlights that weed control efforts are not in vain and it does work. So what I'm showing here is the percent cover reduced of the target invasives. And so if it's above 0, that means that there was successful control here in the blue. And if it's below 0, that means the percent cover actually increased. So we got spread even despite the site being treated. And then on the y-axis is the number of native plant species. And so what this shows is that native diversity is higher at sites where control is effective, and it's lower where invasive spread. So I think this is good evidence for benefits to native plant species when control efforts are effective. This graph is showing hours per hectare invested across all these different sites in native cover. This looks pretty similar to a previous graph I showed. So again, this is promising that it shows that for some sites, the more time you invest, the greater benefits to native plant species, but not for those treatment trap sites, right? So we get a whole lot more variability in the outcomes here. So the light blue is showing the confidence intervals, or basically the variability associated with this response. So weed control does benefit natives, but not in all instances, not in those sites where control is really elusive. And then it could just be that treating weeds alone isn't enough to restore native plant species. So as I showed in this previous graph, like natives do benefit, but it might not be enough just to control the weeds. So what this graph is showing is native cover in sites where invasives were eradicated or not eradicated. And what we can see is that eradication doesn't seem to really influence native cover so much, but restoration does. So the blue bars are showing sites that actually had active restoration, so added seeds or outplanting of natives. So eradication alone might not be enough to benefit natives at really degraded sites, and at those sites, restoration efforts might be really key. Okay, so I think this really highlights that weed management is really complicated. Um, Despite the low levels of eradication, I do think we show really good evidence for a really successful weed management program in a large urban national park where things like air pollution, really high weed pressure, increased fire frequency really complicate management. And so this control of weeds is really complicated by site level factors, as well as finite resources. And I think a key is really learning how to get out of those never-ending treatment cycles, and hopefully these data shed light on how we might be able to do that. And again, it does seem like natives do indeed benefit from successful weed control, but other methods might be really important, like restoration. The last thing I'll say here is that I also looked at differences between outcomes for chemical treatments, so herbicides versus non-chemical treatments. And there actually wasn't a significant difference. So sites that got just chemical or just non-chemical or a combination didn't differ that much. Sites that were treated with both chemical and non-chemical methods had a bit better control, but it was more due to the fact that if you had both those treatment types, it meant that that site was treated a minimum of 2 times. So it was more an effective frequency and not so much because of the type of method employed. And so my recommendations after, working on this project and working really closely with Joey at the park, is that it's really important, if you can, to collect spatially explicit data on weed control efforts. So what treatment type was used, how much person power was invested, the site size, and then weed cover at that site. And then, if possible, it can be really key to collect baseline data and continuing data on native plant communities, because it's a really important metric for understanding what happens to these sites. Investing in monitoring, I acknowledge it's going to take away time from your ability to actually treat weeds, but in the long term, it may increase efficacy. And there's actually been some work modeling this. And there's this one study, I should have cited it here, but it did show that investing time in monitoring doesn't decrease control success, it actually increases it. So there is a trade-off in terms of time allocation, but it can benefit weed management programs overall. And the last thing I'll say is that if you have data sets like this, I'd love to hear from you and just get your thoughts on how studies like this could be useful to you, or if you have ideas for folks that might be sitting on these data sets that could benefit from analysis. I can't guarantee that I'm going to have the time to help everyone analyze their data sets, but I'm hoping to expand these efforts to more areas in the future. Okay, and then hopefully I didn't go too long and we have time for questions.